Have you ever grown frustrated with something that you're working on? Have you ever just wanted to tear something that you love, that you've put time and energy and passion into? Tear it apart, tear it down and watch it burn. Have you imagined what joy you would get from starting again fresh, renewed, purified, released from all the stress and the worries that were previously piling up, closing in on you, and burdening you down so much that you just felt like you could choke? Marvel Comics may not have felt like this when they handed the reins of their Avengers franchise to Jonathan Hickman in 2012, but he immediately began setting about the seeds for the destruction of everything that comic fans held dear. It took him 4 years, 89 issues, across 4 distinct series and a cast of hundreds, but in 2015 he carried out a masterclass in comic storytelling in the 6-part miniseries Secret Wars. This is Moments of Culture, and this is 2015, the year that Jonathan Hickman ended the Marvel comic universe. Marvel Comics has a reputation for overselling big event comics, spectacular short runs of comic tie-ins that they claim will always change everything, but with each time they repeat this trick, it becomes less effective. Inevitably, things do not change that much, and although these comics do sell, the returns feel smaller and smaller. But with Secret Wars, the promise that everything changes was no lie. Jonathan Hickman picked up on the seeds he had laid down over 6 years earlier on his time writing for the Fantastic Four and the Ultimates comic lines. He continued storylines and themes that he'd embedded so deeply throughout his run that, when the dust settled, I felt no other sensation but the need to applaud the man for the audacity of what he had done. Approached in the right frame of mind, Secret Wars is a moment of grand catharsis. It weaves several tight plot threads together to a natural conclusion, where every moment feels grand, epic, but also natural to the characters. The emotional journey that anyone invested in these characters will feel as one by one each of them meets their end, until the end, everything dies, feels suitably epic on every scale. When looking for stories of comparable scale and scope, you really struggle to find many examples done as well as this. And for this short brief run, Jonathan Hickman shows that comics can transcend the stereotypes of their medium and present something that isn't just a comic book, isn't just a graphical novel. This is science fiction at its best. Now, it's important for historical context to remember that before 2012, The Avengers was not Marvel's premier comic strip. In fact, until 2008, when the MCU started with Iron Man, these comics were considered fairly niche compared to the big hitters such as the X-Men and Spider-Man. But with the Joss Whedon directed Avengers movie, everything changed. These characters were suddenly not just important movie franchises in their own right, but the centre of the largest cinematic universe to ever grace our screens. And whilst Kevin Feige and his team were mapping out the next 7 years of their Infinity Saga, Jonathan Hickman was handed the reins to the comic book series it was all supposed to be based on. On December the 5th, and following for every 2 weeks after that, under the Marvel Now branding, his Avengers comic told stories designed to be bigger, bolder, and better than anything we had seen before. And like the MCU, it started with 2 key characters, Iron Man and Captain America. The Marvel Universe's greatest heroes leading the charge. But whilst the stories were bold, colourful, and fairly simplistic in nature, it was also immediately obvious that things weren't exactly the same as we had seen before. These were 2 great heroes, now familiar to audiences across the world for sustaining multi-million-dollar film franchises. On screen, they were antagonistic but friendly. A great double act to be sure, but this? It's certainly a bold panel to start a series like this, not with a flash or a bang, although those are found in great numbers throughout the run, but with what feels more like a church sermon. As the series got into its groove, it settled on a large, interstellar story where the Earth is endangered by a large cosmic event, and although Hickman assembles literally dozens of superheroes to counter this growing peril, he keeps things focused on his 2 central leads. It was the spark that started the fire, a legend that grew in the telling. The great idea was expansion, and it started with 2 men. One was life, and one was death. This is not how people at the time were thinking about Tony Stark and Steve Rogers, but it was intriguing. Things got simultaneously stranger and yet more clear when the Avengers comic strip was joined by a second parallel comic book, The New Avengers. Picking up an idea mooted several years earlier, this comic focused on a much smaller cast of characters, the Illuminati. A small clique within the larger superhero community, Hickman assembled a group of people who thought themselves above the rest. People prepared to look at the bigger picture. Whereas the cast of the Avengers was based off an expanded roster, it still focused on the key players familiar to the MCU: Iron Man, Captain America, Hulk, Thor, Black Widow, Hawkeye. The New Avengers starts with Black Panther, several years before he would eventually cross over to the cinema screens, and he assembles his own unique team to prevent an even greater threat: the end of all things. Through Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic from the Fantastic Four, it is explained to Iron Man, Captain America, Doctor Strange, also several years out from his cinema outings, Black Bolt and Namor, that the universe is ending. This isn't a dastardly plot by some scheming supervillain. This isn't a grave threat from beyond the stars. It is simple physics. Through some excellent high-concept scientific writing, Jonathan Hickman weaves a story about incursions, collisions between parallel universes that almost always end with one or the other wiping themselves out. Something has happened to trigger this process, and now that the multiverse itself is unwinding, each incursion shortening its lifespan and triggering the next, each moment the end of all things is accelerating. We are shown in horrific detail the outcomes of this as a new villain, Black Swan, flees the devastation and tearfully, but not particularly remorsefully, warns the Illuminati what is to come. The situation seems dire, and in the words of Mr. Fantastic himself, everything dies. You, me, everyone in this planet, our sun, our galaxy, and eventually the universe itself. This is simply how things are. It's inevitable, and I accept it. This comic book industry thrives on two things. Firstly, it thrives on a sense of danger and peril. For decades, the publishers at Marvel and DC have had the problem of escalating threat levels. Each baddie has to be bigger and badder than the last. Their plots and schemes have to be more epic and more impactful. How many times have we been told the stakes have never been higher? So perhaps at the time this didn't feel like such a large statement. The universe is always in peril. That's what superhero comics are about. Great men and great women doing great things to save the rest of us. But these comics kept repeating these mantras. Everything dies. It started with two men. One was life and one was death. Captain America, a figure of hope, was swiftly booted out of the New Avengers comics when the others wiped his mind to make him forget what they had done. He was too innocent, too pure to face up to what was coming. And so for several years there was a strange status quo, where one comic was full of life and hope and glorious fights where the greatest heroes of our age took on and beat down the worst villains the universe had to offer. Thanos, the Builders. But parallel to that, a small group of very smart and intelligent people were getting tenser and tenser as they perceived things to be beginning to fall apart. The end was coming. It was coming. The end was getting nearer, and they couldn't hide it anymore. We, the audience along for the ride, watched as the brutal reality hit, and the Avengers, as we thought we knew them, split down the middle. Unfortunately, at Marvel, several key things happen off panel. Captain America is aged up to become an old man, and he hangs up his shield. Thor becomes unworthy and loses his hammer. See Jason Aaron's run on the Thor comics, and he is replaced by a woman. Tony Stark goes a little mental and dons a pure white suit. Reading the saga back from a modern perspective, these feel like niggling defects in what is otherwise a fairly complete run from Jonathan Hickman. In the moment, the idea of comic tie-ins is a great thing. It builds an interconnected universe, but in retrospect I have to say, it often just feels like it makes many collections feel incomplete. To try and get around this, Jonathan Hickman initiated a time skip of 5 months, so he had headspace to put his plans into action without worrying about what everyone else in Marvel was up to at the time. And at first this is a great annoyance, but the time runs out saga, where the storyline is split equally across both comic lines, may have been Marvel's finest hour. Revelations begin dropping like bombshells as Jonathan Hickman manoeuvres the entire roster of Marvel heroes and villains into place. Doctor Strange goes on a journey to find the means of saving the multiverse. Doctor Doom has a secret plan that could impact everything. The Molecule Man, a figure from the great cataclysms of previous Marvel comics of yesteryear, is heavily implicated. Captain Britain appears from nowhere, driven mad by horrors he has seen in another universe. Reed Richards is on the run, hunted by S.H.I.E.L.D. and his wife for the ultimate betrayal. The Maker, a truly horrific villain from an alternative universe within Marvel Comics, reappears, teamed up with Thanos and a group of villains all of their own making. The bitter feud between Namor and Black Panther that was so integral to this run boils to a head. The universe, nay the multiverse itself, is ending, and Iron Man and Captain America are just too angry with each other to care. The sky literally begins to fall in, and all they care about is who lied to who. And so ended Jonathan Hickman's run on the Avengers, with Captain America beating 7 shades out of Tony Stark whilst demanding, "I want to hear you say it. I want to hear you say you lied." Both men staring with hatred into each other's eyes as a spaceship comes crashing down from above. One was life, one was death, and one always wins. Everything dies. 2 parallel comics that, from the outside, appeared so different, but ultimately were one single story. And it could have ended there, a sour, pessimistic, horrific point of view and meditation on the pointlessness of life. But the journey had been fantastic. Jonathan Hickman had served a deconstruction of the very concept of superheroes, men and women who put themselves above everyone else, who stand tall against threats and say, "I will protect you, I will stand firm." He had shown them at their greatest in the Infinity miniseries, where Earth's mightiest heroes literally saved the universe. But then, just a few months and years later, he tore them to their lowest ever point. What do people like this do when faced with no-win scenarios? How do they cope when it all comes crashing down around them? Well, the simple answer was, many of them don't. At the time, Iron Man and Captain America were being idolised as the faces of the world's most profitable film franchise to the silver screen. They were laying into each other with genuine fury on the comic pages. Their story at this point was over. And so begins Secret Wars, at the end of all things. In 2015, to cap off his run and complete his grand tale, Jonathan Hickman was afforded a final 9 issues to put it all right. Because the other things besides peril that comic books thrive on is the idea that nothing should ever change, or at the least, changes must always be incremental. DC and Marvel have a pretty set roster. At each point in time, some characters may be in and some characters may be out, but the cast remains largely the same. Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, Wolverine, Iron Man, Thor, Hulk. Every writer and artist will depict them going through massive upheavals in their life. But ultimately, although there is the appearance of change, in the end, the status quo must be restored. In 2015, Jonathan Hickman's time was up, and he sadly had to return his toys to the box, and try to leave them in a, if not exactly the same state, a comparable one to how he found them. So Secret Wars is a 9-issue masterclass in endings. The very first issue feels a little out of place when read in isolation, as it is the capstone of his Avengers run. It is the final moments of 2 dying universes facing annihilation together. It is the battle between 2 desperate armies, both fighting for survival, mostly unaware that their battles are meaningless compared to what is to come. It is the survivors struggling through this war zone, desperate to find a place of safety. It is the end of 2 continuities that had been running since 1961 and 2000 respectively. The fact that Jonathan Hickman manages to carry this off in a manner respectful to everything that came before is outstanding. 2 main figures from before are gone. Tony Stark and Iron Man's story is over, and their growing hatred for each other had been played out. It was picked up again in some tie-in comics, but in this case it is ultimately inconsequential. Throughout Hickman's run, there has never been enough space to give justice to all of the characters. Some tales are painted through small pictures, a panel here, a throwaway line there, a comment from a third party. Often some of these part tales, such as the sudden appearance of Captain Britain and Hank Pym in the Time Runs Out storyline, feel especially truncated, as these are not characters we've had the luxury of time with. They appear, do their thing, then are put aside. At his worst, Hickman's writing can expose these characters as mere ciphers and plot contrivances, designed to advance us to the next story beat. And yet, in a tale as epic as this, it feels churlish to demand more details that would inevitably destroy the pacing. Despite the epic scope and majesty, this is a story that moves at a fair pace throughout its 4-year run. Instead, the story focuses on the survivors, the ones who did not lose their heads as the world came to an end, but somehow found a way to survive. Reed Richards and Dr. Doom, Jonathan Hickman's protagonists from his early days working within the Marvel Universe, are front and centre, but along for the ride are significant story beats for Doctor Strange, Namor and Black Panther, Thanos and the Maker, 2 different Spider-Men, and so many, many, many more. The concept is both fantastical and simple. The universe has ended, but by sheer force of will and plot contrivances that have been spread out over 3 years of planning, Doctor Doom has saved a vestige of what was lost. He has recreated a small portion of the prior universe, a small fragment of populations who live with him as their god and master. He is both the villain and the hero of the piece, because it is simultaneously about his ego driving him to demand obedience and worship from those he saved, whilst at the same time acknowledging that, if he hadn't saved them, there would be nothing left to save at all. There are a few issues, and several annoying tie-ins that I don't recommend searching for, setting up this world, and then several more that show what happens when it all comes crashing down around Doom's ears. What happens when other survivors from the incursions that ended reality as we know it escape into his refuge? What happens when people refuse to bow before their god? And what happens when Mr. Fantastic, his old nemesis from the very early days of comic history, asks why his wife, Sue Richards, thinks that she is Doom's consort? Did Doom save the universe because he was great and good? Or was he just jealous of the love and affection his old adversary enjoyed? I don't want to spoil the ending, but the concept that such a large, metaphysical science fiction battle boils down to a single argument, a conversation, and an enmity between 2 people is fitting. And while Steve Rogers and Tony Stark's final moments were found wanting, the final moments between Doom and Reed Richards is both upbeat and prophetic. Sadly, this was something of a temporary end for the Fantastic Four in Marvel Comics. The strips ceased to exist, and it would be another 2 years before there were conversations about Reed or Sue returning to the Marvel Universe. Some people blame the fact that Marvel and Disney did not own the film rights to these characters, and say this was done to spite Fox. Certainly the mid-2000s were low points for the X-Men and Fantastic Four franchises, respectively. 2 of the great bastions of the comic book industry found themselves eclipsed by newer, bigger stars. Secret Wars did everything though. It threw out dozens of years of Marvel continuity and put it back down in a very ambiguous state. Everyone and everything that people loved inside these comics was back, but they felt different. They felt fresher, less encumbered by years of backstory. The incursion events set about by Jonathan Hickman acted as a purifying flame to the drama and plot twists going on behind the scenes. Theoretically, writers, previously trapped by competing story beats from a dozen other authors, all battling out at the same time for audience attention, could use this new sense of freedom to explore new avenues. How things went from here is another story though. Secret Wars was not a beginning, and it did not lead to a future renaissance for Marvel comic books. Jonathan Hickman walked away and left the ball for others to pick up. This was an ending, a full stop on one of the greatest stories Marvel had ever told. Epic, grand, intensely personal, and expertly plotted. And now, in a world that has lived through the MCU apotheosis with Infinity War. However, beware. I would not encourage people to start with this book. Please consider starting with Jonathan Hickman's prior